Montana Territory, 1878. Thomas Vance had long ago accepted that his was a life meant for solitude. At 25, he'd already spent more nights under the vast Montana sky than most men twice his age, with only his horse and the occasional coyote call for company. The wide-brimmed hat shading his sun-bronzed face had witnessed 3 harsh winters on the frontier, and the leather of his boots had molded perfectly to his feet through countless miles of tracking stray cattle across the rugged landscape. A man who gets too comfortable around others is a man who ends up disappointed or dead, he muttered to himself as he guided his chestnut mare through the foothills. It was a mantra that had served him well since he'd left his family's failed farm in Missouri at 19. The frontier demanded self-reliance, and Thomas had built his existence around the belief that attachments were luxuries no sensible cowhand could afford. People left. People died. Best to keep to himself and the honest work of the range. The Blackfoot Valley spread before him as he crested the hill, the sprawling Rocking Our ranch where he'd worked these past 2 summers visible in the distance. Despite his competence with cattle and horses, Thomas maintained a careful distance from the other hands. He took his meals quickly, volunteered for the solitary tasks, and kept conversation minimal. Ranch owner Howard Russell had once commented that Thomas was capable as they come, but closed tighter than a winter cabin. The assessment hadn't bothered him in the slightest. What did occasionally trouble him, in those quiet moments when the campfire was dying and sleep refused to come, was a persistent hollow feeling. An emptiness he couldn't quite name that seemed to grow with each passing season. Thomas would quickly dismiss such thoughts as foolishness. What more could a man want than honest work, a reliable horse, and the freedom of the open range? Family men were tied down, vulnerable. He'd seen too many widows and fatherless children struggling against the merciless frontier to envy that fate. The distant rumble of thunder pulled Thomas from his thoughts. Dark clouds gathered on the horizon, promising the kind of violent spring storm that could turn deadly in these parts. He clicked his tongue, urging his mare faster. "Come on, Sadie. Let's get back before that reaches us." The first fat raindrops were just beginning to fall as Thomas approached the ranch, when a sound carried on the wind stopped him cold. Above the rising howl of the storm came an unmistakable cry, a baby's wail. He reined Sadie to a halt, turning his head to pinpoint the source. There, perhaps half a mile off the main trail, a small covered wagon sat abandoned, one wheel clearly broken. The canvas top flapped violently in the strengthening wind. Another cry, louder now, confirmed what Thomas had heard. "Damnation," he muttered, turning Sadie toward the wagon. Common sense told him to continue to the safety of the ranch. Whatever unfortunate souls had broken down would surely return. No one would abandon a wagon for long, especially with a storm brewing. Yet something pulled him forward. Perhaps it was the peculiar angle of the wagon, or the complete absence of horses that should have been tethered nearby. As he drew closer, the baby's cries grew more frantic. Lightning flashed, illuminating the scene in stark brilliance. The wagon sat at a dangerous tilt, the broken wheel having sent it partially off the crude trail. The canvas covering whipped wildly in the wind, threatening to tear free entirely. And there, huddled beneath what little protection the wagon offered, was a young woman clutching a bundle to her chest. Her head snapped up at his approach, fear evident in her wide eyes. She couldn't have been more than 20, with rain-soaked golden hair plastered against her pale face. Her simple blue calico dress was thoroughly drenched, and she shivered violently as she pulled the crying infant closer. "Ma'am," Thomas called over the storm, dismounting quickly. "Are you hurt?" "Please," she responded, her voice barely audible above the wind. "Help us." As Thomas approached, he saw that her cheeks were flushed with fever, her eyes glassy and unfocused. This was more than just a stranded traveler. The woman was clearly ill. "I'm Thomas Vance, ma'am. I work at the Rocking R, just a few miles from here." He crouched beside her, noting how she swayed slightly even while seated. "Where's your husband? Your traveling companions?" "Gone," she whispered, and for a moment Thomas wasn't sure if she'd meant dead or simply departed. "The wheel broke yesterday. Jacob went for help, but—" Her voice trailed off as she looked down at the baby, who continued to cry. "He never came back." Thomas felt a coldness that had nothing to do with the rain. A man wouldn't abandon his wife and child unless something had happened to him. These parts weren't particularly dangerous compared to other territories, But accidents happened. A spooked horse, a hidden ravine, a chance encounter with a bear. The possibilities were endless and grim. "What's your name, ma'am?" "Felicity. Felicity Dawson." She looked up at him, her blue eyes clearing momentarily. "And this is Emma. She's 4 months old." Another crack of lightning, closer now, followed immediately by a deafening boom of thunder. The baby's cries intensified, and Thomas made a quick decision. "Mrs. Dawson, you and your daughter need shelter. I'm taking you back to the ranch." When she didn't immediately respond, he added, "You're burning with fever, and this storm's only getting worse." Felicity nodded weakly, allowing Thomas to help her to her feet. She swayed dangerously, and he quickly steadied her with an arm around her waist. The baby, Emma, continued to wail, though the sound was partially swallowed by the storm. "Can you ride?" he asked, eyeing Sadie, who stood patiently despite the weather. "I don't think so," Felicity admitted, her words slurring slightly. "I feel strange." Thomas nodded grimly. "I'll take the baby. You hold on to me." With careful movements, he helped Felicity secure Emma inside her shawl, then lifted them both onto Sadie. He mounted behind them, one arm securely around Felicity's waist while she cradled her daughter. The position was awkward, and Sadie snorted her displeasure at the unfamiliar weight, but Thomas had little choice. "Hang on," he instructed, feeling Felicity lean heavily against his chest as he urged Sadie forward. The ride back to the ranch was harrowing. The storm intensified, turning the trail to mud that sucked at Sadie's hooves with each labored step. Twice, Thomas felt Felicity begin to slip and had to tighten his grip, pulling her back against him. The baby's cries had diminished to whimpers, which concerned him almost more than the louder wailing had. By the time the ranch buildings came into view, Thomas was soaked to the bone and Felicity burned against him with fever. She had fallen silent during the last mile, responding only with faint murmurs when he spoke to her. "Almost there," he assured her as they approached the main house. It was a substantial 2-story structure that housed Howard Russell, his wife Mabel, and their 2 teenage daughters. Thomas had never set foot inside. Ranch hands kept to the bunkhouse, but he knew Mrs. Russell had a reputation for kindness, particularly toward those in need. Light glowed welcomingly from the windows as Thomas guided Sadie directly to the front porch. Before he could call out, the door swung open to reveal Mrs. Russell herself, her round face creased with concern. "Thomas Vance. What on earth?" Her eyes widened as she took in the scene. Thomas supporting a barely conscious young woman and a tiny infant. "Bring them in immediately." What followed was a flurry of activity. Mrs. Russell's practiced efficiency transformed the parlor into a temporary sickroom. Felicity, now delirious with fever, was settled on the sofa while Emma was unwrapped from her damp blankets and assessed with expert hands. "The little one seems healthy enough, just hungry and cold," Mrs. Russell pronounced, wrapping Emma in a dry blanket. "But her mother." She placed a hand on Felicity's forehead and frowned deeply. "Howard, send Billy for Dr. Green." Thomas stood awkwardly by the door, dripping onto the polished wooden floor. He felt strangely reluctant to leave, despite knowing his presence was unnecessary now. Mrs. Russell seemed to notice his hesitation. "You did right bringing them here, Thomas," she said kindly. "Where did you find them?" Thomas explained the abandoned wagon and Felicity's story about her husband going for help. "Poor dear," Mrs. Russell sighed. "These mountains can be cruel to newcomers." She glanced at Thomas's sodden clothing. "Now get yourself to the bunkhouse before you catch your death as well." Thomas nodded, but his eyes lingered on the young woman and her baby. Something about their vulnerability stirred an unfamiliar protective instinct within him, one that directly contradicted his carefully constructed philosophy of detachment. "Will they be all right?" he heard himself asking. Mrs. Russell's expression softened. "God willing. Now go on. I'll send word when the doctor's been." The next morning dawned clear and bright, as if the previous night's storm had never happened. Thomas rose earlier than usual, his sleep having been fitful and filled with dreams of a golden-haired woman calling for help that never came. He completed his morning chores with distracted efficiency, his thoughts repeatedly turning to the main house. It was near noon when Billy, the youngest ranch hand at 16, found Thomas repairing a section of fence. "Mrs. Russell wants you at the house," Billy announced, clearly enjoying his role as messenger. "Says it's about that pretty lady and her baby." Thomas frowned at the boy's grin, but set aside his tools without comment. The walk to the main house seemed both too long and too short, his mind cycling through possibilities. Had Felicity's condition worsened? Had news come of her husband? Mrs. Russell met him at the door, her expression unreadable. The doctor's been and gone. Mrs. Dawson has pneumonia, but he believes she'll recover with proper care. Relief washed through Thomas, surprising him with its intensity. That's good news. Indeed. She's awake now and asking about you. I thought you might want to speak with her. Thomas hesitated, suddenly uncertain. His role in this situation should have ended the moment he delivered Felicity and Emma to safety. Involving himself further went against every principle of self-preservation he'd cultivated over the years. Yet he found himself following Mrs. Russell into the parlor, where Felicity Dawson sat propped up with pillows. Her golden hair had been neatly braided, and though her face remained pale, her eyes were clear and alert. In a basket beside her, Emma slept peacefully. "Mr. Vance," Felicity said when she saw him, her voice raspy but stronger than the night before. "I wanted to thank you properly. Mrs. Russell tells me you saved our lives." Thomas shifted uncomfortably under her direct gaze. "Anyone would have done the same, ma'am. But it wasn't anyone. It was you." Her smile, though weak, transformed her face, revealing a natural beauty that even illness couldn't diminish. "And please, call me Felicity." Thomas nodded, uncertain how to respond to her gratitude. "How are you feeling, Felicity?" "Better, though Dr. Green says I need rest." Her expression clouded. "I've also been thinking about Jacob. I'm so afraid something has happened to him." Mrs. Russell, who had remained by the door, spoke gently. "Howard has sent 2 men to search, dear. They'll also bring your belongings from the wagon." "Thank you," Felicity whispered, her eyes filling with tears. "You've all been so kind to strangers." "That's how we survive out here," Mrs. Russell replied. "By helping one another." Thomas remained silent, struck by the contradiction between Mrs. Russell's words and his own philosophy. Had he not survived precisely by avoiding such entanglements? Felicity's next words pulled him from his thoughts. "Mr. Vance, Thomas, would you tell me about yourself? I'd like to know more about the man who came to our rescue." The request caught him off guard. "Not much to tell, ma'am. I'm just a cowhand." "Everyone has a story," she persisted, her gaze steady despite her weakened state. Thomas found himself sharing the bare outlines of his life, his childhood in Missouri, his journey west, his 2 years at the Rocking R. He omitted the failures and losses that had shaped his solitary nature, speaking instead of practical matters like cattle drives and breaking horses. Throughout his account, Felicity watched him with an attentiveness that made Thomas increasingly self-conscious. It had been years since anyone had shown genuine interest in his life, and he found the experience both uncomfortable and oddly gratifying. Their conversation was interrupted when Emma awoke with hungry cries. Mrs. Russell immediately stepped forward. "I'll leave you to feed her, dear. Thomas, I'm sure you have work to return to." Thomas nodded, relieved at the excuse to escape the unfamiliar intimacy of the situation. As he turned to leave, Felicity called after him. "Will you come again tomorrow, Thomas? Please." He hesitated, every instinct warning him to maintain his distance. Yet he found himself nodding. "If you'd like." Her smile was like sunrise after a long night. "I would. Very much." The days that followed established an unexpected pattern in Thomas's carefully structured life. Each afternoon, after completing his most pressing duties, he would visit the main house where Felicity and Emma had taken up temporary residence. Their conversations ranged widely, from Felicity's childhood in St. Louis to Thomas's dreams of someday owning land of his own. He learned that Felicity was 22, widowed once before she met Jacob Dawson. Her first husband had died of influenza less than a year into their marriage, leaving her alone and desperate in a city where opportunities for young women were limited. Jacob, a shopkeeper passing through, had offered her a fresh start in Montana Territory, where he planned to establish a general store in the growing settlement of Helena. He was kind, Felicity explained on the 3rd day of Thomas's visits, as she gently rocked Emma in her arms. Not a passionate match, perhaps, but a sensible one. He offered security, and I needed that desperately. Thomas, seated somewhat stiffly in a chair nearby, considered her words. "And now?" Felicity's expression darkened. "Now I fear I'm alone again. It's been 5 days, Thomas. If Jacob were able, he would have returned or sent help. Thomas couldn't disagree. The search parties had found no trace of Jacob Dawson, though they'd recovered Felicity's trunk and other belongings from the wagon. The most likely explanation was that he had met with some accident in the wilderness, fallen from his horse, perhaps in some remote ravine where searchers hadn't yet looked. "What will you do?" he asked carefully. Felicity gazed down at her daughter, her fingers gently stroking the infant's cheek. "I don't know. I have some money saved, but not enough to start over completely. And with Emma." She trailed off, blinking rapidly. An uncomfortable silence fell between them. Thomas felt a dangerous impulse to offer comfort, perhaps even assistance, but caught himself. Getting involved in Felicity's problems would be crossing a line he'd drawn years ago, after watching his own father destroy himself trying to support neighbors who ultimately abandoned them when drought came. "Mrs. Russell mentioned that Helena needs a schoolteacher," he said instead, keeping his tone neutral. "Said the last one married a miner and moved to California." Felicity looked up, a hint of hope in her eyes. "I taught briefly in St. Louis, before my first marriage. Might be worth considering then." Their conversation shifted to safer topics, but Thomas left that day with a growing awareness of his own internal conflict. The wall he'd built around himself, his conviction that attachment led only to pain, was developing cracks, and he wasn't entirely certain he wanted to repair them. By the end of Felicity's second week at the ranch, her health had improved significantly. Dr. Green pronounced her well enough to travel, though he advised against immediate long journeys. During this time, no word or sign of Jacob Dawson had emerged, and even the most optimistic among the searchers had accepted the likely truth. The man was dead, another casualty of the unforgiving frontier. Felicity bore the news with a quiet dignity that Thomas found himself admiring. She grieved, certainly, but there was a resilience to her that spoke of a woman who had faced loss before and survived. "Life continues," she told Thomas as they sat on the porch one evening, Emma sleeping peacefully in her basket nearby. "It has to for Emma's sake." Thomas nodded, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in shades of gold and purple. "What will you do now?" "Mrs. Russell has kindly offered to let us stay until I can make arrangements." Felicity's hand smoothed her skirt, a gesture Thomas had come to recognize as a sign of her gathering her thoughts. "I wrote to the town council and Helena about the teaching position you mentioned. They've replied with interest, though they can't offer much in the way of salary." "It's a start," Thomas offered. "Yes." She turned to look at him directly, her blue eyes reflecting the evening light. "Thomas, may I ask you something personal?" He tensed slightly, but nodded. "Why do you keep yourself so apart from everyone? Mrs. Russell says you've never joined the other hands for social gatherings, never accompanied them to town on Saturday nights." Her voice held no judgment, only genuine curiosity. "You're clearly capable of friendship, yet you seem determined to avoid it." The directness of her question caught him off guard. Thomas stared out at the landscape, considering his response. Part of him wanted to deflect with some vague platitude, but something about Felicity's openness with her own story made him reluctant to offer less than honesty in return. "I learned early that depending on others is a risk not worth taking," he finally said, his voice low. "My father was a generous man. Too generous. When drought hit Missouri, he helped neighbors at the expense of our own farm. Those same neighbors disappeared when we needed help in return." The bitterness in his voice surprised even him. "He died believing people were fundamentally good. I don't share that belief." Felicity was quiet for a moment. "And yet you stopped for a stranger in a storm." Thomas shifted uncomfortably. "That was different." "Was it?" Her voice was gentle. "You risked your safety for people you'd never met, with no expectation of reward." "I couldn't just leave a woman and baby to die," he muttered. "No, you couldn't. Because despite what you believe about people, Thomas Vance, you are fundamentally good." She reached out tentatively, her fingers brushing against his hand where it rested on the porch railing. "And goodness recognizes goodness in others." Thomas felt an unfamiliar warmth spreading through him at her touch. It was a simple gesture, yet it seemed to bridge a distance greater than the physical space between them. For a brief moment, he allowed himself to imagine what it might be like to welcome such connections rather than resist them. The moment was broken by Emma's soft whimper as she began to wake. Felicity withdrew her hand, turning her attention to her daughter, and Thomas was left with the lingering sensation of her touch and the unsettling feeling that his carefully constructed worldview was being challenged in ways he hadn't anticipated. The following days brought a flurry of activity as preparations were made for Felicity's move to Helena. The town council had confirmed her appointment as schoolteacher, with accommodations provided in a small house adjacent to the schoolhouse. It was a modest beginning, but one that offered her and Emma a chance at independence and stability. Thomas found himself increasingly involved in these preparations, despite his initial intentions to maintain a respectful distance. He helped repair a trunk damaged during the storm, offered advice on which stagecoach company was most reliable, and even rode to Helena himself to ensure the promised accommodations were indeed ready for occupation. This last task revealed something Thomas hadn't expected. The small house was little more than a crude cabin with a leaking roof and drafty windows. The school itself was in better condition, but the living quarters clearly hadn't been properly maintained since the previous teacher's departure months earlier. Thomas returned to the rocking R with this knowledge weighing heavily on him. The thought of Felicity and Emma living in such conditions through the approaching autumn and winter troubled him deeply. Without conscious decision, he found himself visiting the ranch's storage barn, assessing supplies of shingles, lumber, and window glass. Howard Russell discovered him there, inventorying materials. "Planning a project, Thomas?" the ranch owner asked, his weathered face curious. Thomas explained what he'd found in Helena and his concerns about Felicity's future accommodations. He half expected Russell to dismiss his worries or question his involvement, but the older man merely nodded thoughtfully. "Take what you need," Russell said after a moment, "and a wagon to transport it. Consider it the ranch's contribution to the town's education system." Thomas blinked in surprise. "I'd planned to purchase the materials myself, sir." Russell waved this away. "Nonsense. That schoolteacher's cabin should have been maintained by the town council in the first place. Besides," he added with a knowing look, "Mrs. Russell would have my hide if I didn't help the Dawson woman after all she's been through." 2 days later, Thomas set out for Helena with a wagon loaded with building supplies and a determination that surprised even himself. He'd arranged for a week away from the ranch. Time enough, he calculated, to make the necessary repairs before Felicity and Emma arrived. The work was solitary and physically demanding, exactly the kind of task Thomas typically preferred. Yet as he replaced rotting floorboards and patched the leaking roof, he found his thoughts constantly returning to the woman and child who would soon occupy this space. He imagined Felicity sitting by the repaired fireplace in winter, Emma taking her first steps across the smooth wooden floor he was laying. These images drove him to work from dawn until dusk, pushing through exhaustion to ensure every detail was properly attended to. On the 4th day, as Thomas was replacing a broken window pane, a voice behind him caused him to nearly drop the glass. "So this is where you disappeared to." He turned to find Felicity standing in the doorway, Emma bundled in her arms. The sight of them, Felicity's golden hair catching the afternoon sunlight, her expression a mixture of surprise and something warmer, caused an unfamiliar tightness in his chest. "Mrs. Russell mentioned you'd gone to Helena on an errand," Felicity continued, stepping inside to survey the transformed interior. "She didn't mention you were rebuilding an entire house." Thomas set down the window pane carefully. "It needed some work." "Some work," Felicity repeated, her gaze taking in the new floor, the patched roof, the freshly plastered walls. "Thomas, this must have taken days." "5, actually. I'm nearly finished." He wiped his hands on his trousers, suddenly conscious of his disheveled appearance. "I thought you weren't coming until next week." The stagecoach had space sooner than expected. Mrs. Russell insisted we take advantage. Felicity moved further into the room, her eyes wide with wonder. "I can't believe you did all this." Thomas shrugged, uncomfortable with her obvious gratitude. The place wasn't fit for winter, especially with a baby. Felicity crossed to where he stood, and, in a gesture that caught him completely off guard, rose on tiptoes to press a soft kiss to his cheek. "Thank you," she whispered. Thomas froze, overwhelmed by her closeness, the gentle pressure of her lips, the clean scent of lavender that clung to her hair. When she stepped back, he found himself unable to form words, his carefully maintained emotional barriers crumbling like the old plaster he'd scraped from these walls. "I should finish the window," he finally managed, turning back to his task with hands that weren't quite steady. "Of course," Felicity replied, and though he didn't look at her, Thomas could hear the smile in her voice. Emma and I will unpack our things. Perhaps afterward you'll join us for supper? It's the least I can offer in return for all you've done. Thomas wanted to refuse, to complete his work and return to the familiar solitude of the rocking R. Instead, he heard himself accepting her invitation, committing to further entanglement in a situation he'd never intended to enter. That evening, seated at the small table he'd repaired, sharing a simple meal Felicity had prepared, Thomas experienced something he'd almost forgotten existed: the warmth of companionship, the simple pleasure of conversation unhindered by suspicion or reserve. As darkness fell and lanterns were lit, casting a golden glow throughout the small cabin, he found himself reluctant to leave. "Will you return to the ranch tomorrow?" Felicity asked as she settled Emma in the cradle Thomas had discovered in the schoolhouse attic and restored. "I should. Mr. Russell only gave me a week." Felicity nodded, disappointment flashing briefly across her features before she schooled them into a smile. "Of course. You've already done far more than anyone could have expected." Thomas hesitated, torn between the pull of his established life and the unexpected appeal of this new connection. "I could stay another day," he heard himself offer, "to make sure everything's secure before winter." Felicity's genuine smile was like sunshine breaking through clouds. "I'd like that very much." One day became 2, then 3, as Thomas found increasingly creative reasons to extend his stay in Helena. There were shelves to build, a garden plot to prepare for spring planting, a woodpile to stock before the first snow. Each task seemed essential, each day in Felicity and Emma's company more valuable than the last. They fell into an easy rhythm, Thomas working on the cabin or helping at the schoolhouse, which was preparing to open for the fall term. Felicity organizing her teaching materials and caring for Emma, occasionally assisting with his projects when the baby napped. In the evenings they would share meals, their conversations growing deeper and more personal with each passing day. Thomas found himself sharing stories he'd never told anyone, about his mother's death when he was 12, about the painful loss of their family farm, about his lonely years drifting from ranch to ranch before finding a temporary home at the Rocking R. Felicity listened without judgment, offering her own experiences in return, her childhood in a house too full of siblings to ever feel truly seen, her first marriage to a man she barely knew, her complicated feelings about Jacob Dawson's apparent death. "I respected him," she confessed one evening as they sat before the fire. "He offered me safety when I desperately needed it. But there was always something missing." She looked down at her hands. "Is it terrible that I sometimes feel more grief for the security I've lost than for the man himself?" "No," Thomas replied softly. "I think it's honest." On the 10th day after Thomas had first arrived in Helena, a letter came from Howard Russell, inquiring about his delayed return. The message was polite but pointed. The fall roundup would begin soon, and Thomas's skills would be needed. "You have to go back," Felicity said when he showed her the letter, her expression carefully neutral despite the sadness in her eyes. Thomas nodded, feeling strangely torn. The Rocking R had been the closest thing to home he'd known in years. His position there was secure, the work familiar and satisfying. Yet the prospect of returning to the isolation of his former life had lost its appeal. "I'll come back," he found himself promising. "When I can." Felicity's smile was tinged with something like resignation. "You'll be welcome, Thomas. Always." The journey back to the ranch seemed longer than Thomas remembered, his thoughts continually returning to the small cabin in Helena and its occupants. By the time he arrived at the Rocking R, his mood was so obviously distracted that even the other hands noticed. "Looks like Vance left his mind back in Helena," he overheard one of them comment. Or maybe his heart. The word struck uncomfortably close to the truth. Despite throwing himself into the demanding work of the roundup, Thomas found himself counting days until he might reasonably request time to visit Helena again. The solitude he had once cherished now felt hollow, his carefully constructed independence more like isolation than freedom. It was Mrs. Russell who finally confronted him, finding him one evening as he sat alone on the porch of the bunkhouse, staring at the road that led toward Helena. "You know," she said without preamble, settling beside him, "Howard and I met when I was teaching school in Wyoming Territory." Thomas glanced at her, surprised by the personal disclosure. He was passing through with a cattle drive. stopped to help when our schoolhouse roof collapsed after a heavy snow. She smiled at the memory. By the time the roof was repaired, we both knew we'd found something worth keeping. Thomas remained silent, uncertain how to respond to this unexpected confidence. My point, Thomas, is that sometimes life offers opportunities we didn't go looking for. The wise person recognizes them. She patted his hand gently, even if it means changing plans they thought were firmly set. After Mrs. Russell left, Thomas remained on the porch for a long time, her words echoing in his mind. For years, he'd built his life around the belief that self-sufficiency was the only safe path, that connections led inevitably to disappointment or betrayal. Yet his experiences with Felicity and Emma had begun to challenge that conviction, opening possibilities he'd long ago dismissed. The realization, when it finally crystallized, was both terrifying and exhilarating. He wanted more than just occasional visits to Helena. He wanted a permanent place in Felicity and Emma's lives, and he wanted them in his. But wanting wasn't enough. Thomas was acutely aware that Felicity was still technically in mourning for a husband presumed dead, but not confirmed so. Society had strict expectations about such matters, and Helena was a small community where reputations mattered, especially for a schoolteacher. Moreover, he had no assurance that Felicity shared his emerging feelings, or would welcome the dramatic change in circumstances he was considering. These thoughts preoccupied him through the remainder of the roundup. By the time the cattle were counted and sorted, Thomas had reached a decision. He requested a private meeting with Howard Russell and laid out his intentions plainly. "I'm grateful for the opportunities you've given me here," Thomas concluded, facing his employer across the desk in the ranch office. "But I believe my future lies elsewhere." Russell studied him thoughtfully. "Helena's a growing town. Could use a man with your skills: carpentry, horsebreaking, general ranching knowledge." A knowing smile crossed his weathered face. "And I hear they've recently acquired a fine schoolteacher who might appreciate having a friend nearby." Thomas felt heat rise in his face, but didn't deny the implication. "There's the matter of her husband," he said instead. "No body's been found, and legally, frontier law tends to be practical about such things," Russell replied. "If a man's been missing this long without word, most consider it abandonment at best, death at worst. Either way, the woman's free to proceed with her life after a reasonable period." He leaned forward. "That said, Thomas, I'd advise patience. These matters need to unfold naturally, especially with a child involved." Thomas nodded, relieved at the older man's understanding and counsel. "I don't intend to rush anything. I just want to be available, if I'm wanted." A wise approach. Russell rose, extending his hand. "You've been a valuable hand, Thomas. You'll be missed here, but I believe you're making the right choice." 2 weeks later, Thomas Vance arrived in Helena with his few possessions loaded in a wagon, along with a letter of recommendation from Howard Russell and a cashier's draft representing his accumulated wages from the rocking R. His plan, carefully considered during sleepless nights, was to establish himself in the growing town before approaching Felicity about his deeper intentions. Helena in late autumn was bustling with activity as the community prepared for winter. Thomas quickly found work helping the local livery stable expand their facilities, his carpentry skills and knowledge of horses making him immediately valuable. He rented a small room above the general store, deliberately choosing accommodations some distance from the schoolhouse to avoid any appearance of impropriety. For the first week, he refrained from calling on Felicity, instead focusing on establishing his position in the community. He made connections with the blacksmith, the mercantile owner, and several ranchers on the outskirts of town who expressed interest in his services come spring. By the time he finally walked the path to the schoolhouse, he had secured not only immediate employment, but prospects for a stable future. The school day was just ending when Thomas arrived. Children streamed from the building, their voices filling the crisp afternoon air. Through the open door, he could see Felicity at her desk, her golden head bent over papers. The sight of her, so focused and composed, caused a tightness in his chest that was becoming familiar. A small boy, no more than 7, noticed Thomas waiting and called out, "Teacher, there's a man here." Felicity looked up, her expression transforming from polite inquiry to genuine delight when she recognized him. "Thomas." She rose quickly, smoothing her dark blue dress. "What a wonderful surprise." Thomas removed his hat as he entered the schoolroom, suddenly conscious of its lingering smell of chalk and wood smoke. I hope I'm not interrupting your work. Not at all. I was just grading arithmetic exercises. Her eyes searched his face. How was the roundup? Mrs. Russell mentioned in her letter that it kept everyone quite busy. It did. Thomas hesitated, then decided directness was best. I've left the rocking R, Felicity. I've taken work here in Helena. Felicity's eyes widened. You've moved to Helena? Permanently. I have. Thomas gripped his hat tighter, finding courage to continue. I found I couldn't stay away. A flush spread across Felicity's cheeks, but before she could respond, a cry from the adjoining cabin announced Emma's awakening from her afternoon nap. I should, of course. Thomas stepped back. I didn't mean to keep you. I just wanted you to know I was here. In town. Felicity hesitated, then impulsively reached out to touch his arm. Come for supper tomorrow? 6 o'clock? Emma would love to see you. Only Emma? The words slipped out before Thomas could stop them. Felicity's blush deepened, but her gaze remained steady. No, Thomas. Not only Emma. The following evening marked the beginning of a new pattern. Twice a week, Thomas would join Felicity and Emma for supper. Sometimes he would arrive early to help with preparations or to complete small repairs around the cabin and schoolhouse. Other evenings, he would bring special treats from the mercantile, a jar of preserved peaches, a length of bright ribbon for Emma's growing curls, occasionally a book of poetry or essays that they would read aloud by the fire after Emma was asleep. As winter settled over Helena, Thomas found himself spending more and more time at the little cabin. He built shelves for Felicity's growing collection of books, crafted a rocking horse for Emma's approaching first birthday, and ensured the woodpile never dwindled despite the frequent heavy snows. In return, Felicity mended his shirts, shared her simple but delicious meals, and filled his evenings with conversation and companionship that made his former solitude seem unimaginably bleak. The townspeople noticed, of course. In a community as small as Helena, such a developing relationship could hardly escape attention. Some whispered about propriety, noting that Jacob Dawson had been missing less than 6 months. Others, more compassionate or practical, observed that frontier life required adaptability, and that the schoolteacher and the carpenter conducted themselves with perfect respectability in public. Felicity bore the occasional raised eyebrows with quiet dignity, never allowing town gossip to affect her professional demeanor. Thomas, for his part, was careful to maintain appropriate distances when others were present, though it became increasingly difficult to conceal the depth of his feelings. It was Emma who often bridged these careful separations, her natural affection for Thomas growing with each visit. By December, she would toddle to him the moment he appeared at the door, arms raised in clear demand to be lifted. Thomas obliged each time, his heart expanding at the simple trust in her bright blue eyes so like her mother's. On Christmas Eve, Thomas arrived at the cabin with his arms full of parcels, a new woolen shawl for Felicity, a hand-carved set of building blocks for Emma, and a small pine tree that filled the room with its fresh, sharp scent. It's perfect, Felicity declared as they decorated the tree with paper stars and strings of dried berries. Emma watched in wide-eyed fascination from her place on a quilt by the fire, occasionally clapping her hands when a new ornament was added. Later, after a special supper and the exchange of gifts, with Emma sleeping peacefully in her cradle, Thomas and Felicity sat side by side before the fire. A comfortable silence settled between them, broken only by the occasional pop and crackle of burning logs. I never expected this, Felicity said softly, her gaze fixed on the flames. After Jacob disappeared, I thought I would simply endure. For Emma's sake. Thomas turned to look at her, the firelight casting her profile in golden relief. And now I find myself hoping again. She met his eyes, her expression vulnerable but direct. Because of you, Thomas. The honesty in her voice stripped away the last of his hesitation. Thomas reached for her hand, enfolding it in his own. Felicity, I need to tell you something. When I found you and Emma in that storm, I believed I was simply doing what any decent person would do. But now I understand it was more than that. He took a deep breath, committing himself to words he'd never imagined speaking. That storm changed the course of my life. You and Emma changed me. I used to believe the safest path was to remain apart from others, to never risk disappointment or loss. But I was wrong. Felicity's hand tightened around his, encouraging him to continue. "I love you," Thomas said simply. "Both of you. And if you'll have me, I want to build a life with you. Not just suppers twice a week or repairs when needed, but a real life. Together." Tears welled in Felicity's eyes, but her smile was radiant. "I was beginning to wonder if you'd ever say it." "Does that mean?" "Yes, Thomas. Yes." She moved closer, her free hand coming to rest against his cheek. "I love you too. I think I have since you found us in that storm and refused to leave us behind." When their lips met, it felt to Thomas like coming home to a place he'd never known existed, a place of warmth and belonging that had been waiting for him all along. The town of Helena officially declared Jacob Dawson deceased in the spring of 1879, 6 months after his disappearance. The legal pronouncement, while a formality that surprised no one, cleared the way for Felicity and Thomas to announce their engagement publicly. They were married on a bright June morning, with Emma, now almost 18 months old, serving as an enthusiastic if somewhat distracted flower girl. Howard and Mabel Russell made the journey from the rocking R to attend, along with several ranch hands who had known Thomas during his time there. "Never thought I'd see the day," Billy commented during the celebration that followed the ceremony. Thomas Vance, the most closed-off cowboy in Montana, getting hitched and looking happy about it. Thomas, overhearing the remark as he held Emma while Felicity received congratulations from her students' parents, merely smiled. The observation was accurate enough. He had indeed undergone a transformation few who knew him before would have predicted. The town council, pleased to retain their well-respected teacher, offered the Vances continued use of the cabin beside the schoolhouse, with Thomas contributing his carpentry skills to expand the structure during the summer months. By autumn, what had once been a drafty single-room dwelling had become a comfortable three-room home, with plans for further additions as their family grew. And grow it did. In the spring of 1880, Emma gained a baby brother, Jacob Thomas Vance, named in part to honor the man who had given Felicity a chance at a new life in Montana, and in part for the father who adored him from his first breath. On quiet evenings, with the children asleep and household tasks complete, Thomas and Felicity would often sit on the porch of their expanded home, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in shades of gold and purple. In these moments, Thomas would sometimes reflect on the storm that had changed everything, the desperate ride through rain and thunder, the weight of a feverish woman and crying baby in his arms. "What are you thinking?" Felicity would ask, noticing his contemplative expression. And Thomas, no longer the solitary man who believed attachment was a weakness, would draw his wife closer and answer with simple truth. "I'm thinking that some storms bring destruction, but others wash away obstacles to reveal the path home." For Thomas Vance, who had once believed the frontier was no place for love, had discovered that love was precisely what the frontier needed most: the courage to reach out in a storm, the strength to carry others to safety, and the wisdom to recognize that true survival meant opening one's heart rather than closing it against life's uncertainties. In the end, the man who had found a woman and baby abandoned in a storm had himself been found, and in that finding, had discovered not just a family, but the home he'd been searching for all along.